All right, welcome back, everyone. Daniel Tutt here with Emancipations, and I'm extremely honored to welcome my good friend and comrade Andrew Flores, aka the Big Signorelli, or the Big Sig, to the show for the first time, but not really the first time because you've been on many study groups. But your first time as a guest, as a podcast guest. So it's really nice to have you, Andrew. Andrew is a practicing psychoanalyst in San Diego and has been with us for like really almost every major text that we've studied. I would say you're part of it and contributed, especially to our psychoanalytic investigations, Lacan and so on. His orientation is Lacanian, and one of the things that I think Andrew and I both have a lot of fidelity to is the proposal that psychoanalysis is not, at least from like a socialist or an emancipatory or a Marxist point of view, it gets a bad rap. And I think rightly so, it gets a bad rap. But I think we are trying to push back against some of those cliches about psychoanalysis, that it's some kind of detached, petty bourgeois, I don't know, like lifestyle practice or something like this. There's many different, we could do a whole episode just looking at the various critiques that Marxists impose onto psychoanalysis. I was just talking to somebody the other day, Andrew, and they were saying that, it's now a fad, whatever, amongst professionals to say, oh, I do psychoanalysis because it's the most rigorous and so on. But I think that there is a more authentic, if that's the right word, form of a psychoanalytic approach, and that is indeed a necessary supplement to Marxism. And you can check out the last conversation that Andrew and I did on Leon Rosichner, and on his groundbreaking book, Freud and the Limits of Bourgeois Individualism. So that's a little opening proviso, but tonight we're going to have a conversation with you all about the concept of the drive. And this will be a way for us to get a better grasp on what kind of like a fundamental concept. Lacan identified it amongst the 4 fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis. We want to investigate it and hopefully offer a kind of elucidation of it. Andrew has created, as he usually does, a good reading list, which we'll put in the show notes, for texts you can read, essays you can read from Freud and Lacan on the concept of drive. Andrew, could we begin with where you think the best place to actually begin to study the concept of drive really is? And then I have my own thoughts, but I'd like to kick it to you first with that question. And welcome to the show.
Yeah, first off, it's really, really, really great to be on the show. Like, I've always been participating, but it's different when you're the one being interviewed versus interviewing like you, which, I mean, you were first the friend of the show on the Vanishing Mediators channel when we did the psychoanalysis of the politics of the family. And then I had you back on for the Logician and the Savant essay, inspired by Seminar 16. And then, yeah, it was the project on Rose Itchner. And just to kind of preface, an analyst in formation and training, right? I'm not just a practice. I'm a newbie, but I think the main thing is that, one, you're seeking supervision, and also the impact of your own psychoanalysis, like as undergoing like as an analysan, which I think is kind of interesting that many people on the left, or even like the socialist left, that have a bad taste in their mouth about psychoanalysis. I'd say, like, and just to anybody, even in critical theory, psychoanalysis is great because you could pressure test it by actually going onto the couch and free associating and learning about not only yourself, but what makes you tick, what makes you suffer, why do you keep getting caught in these feedback loops of repetition, compulsion, to use a jargony term. But like, what is it that makes you suffer? What propels you to try to avert that and end up in the same position? And just to inquire about what goes beyond just you, but familial relations. where you see like, these patterns, these complexes that formulate your unconscious arise in as early as childhood through the family unit, etc. Um, so there's that. But I guess to answer your question regarding where to go to drive, I think um, there's two works, and it's in Freud. I'd say first, I call it the blueprint of the drive because it's not explicitly there. It's Freud's 1905 Three Essays on the Theory of Sexuality. Now, one thing that Lacan says in Seminar 4 is that if you were to read the original draft of the 1905 essays, that you would not recognize it a bit, because from 1905 and then in between like 1914 and 15, when he develops the concept of narcissism, we get an understanding of this split between the sexual instinct or the drive and the self-preservation of what we would call the damming of the libido, which is the ego formation. And then I would say then he adds like prior to Beyond the Pleasure Principle, he adds one more footnote in like 1919. But then the major explicit essay on the drive is Instincts and the Vicissitudes, where he actually wants to interrogate. And this is what's beautiful about Lacan. Like, whether or not you agree with Lacan, I think Lacan gives a very beautiful reading of Freud's project. I think the second best would be Laplanche. Um, Instincts and the Vicissitudes starts off with a question concerning speculative concepts and what constitutes a science, and that we shouldn't take our concepts for granted. And he, as in Freud, will question the concept of the instinct and relate the term instinct genealogically back to like modern physiology. But he then turns from instinct to the question of what he'll call the drive, which he thinks differentiates us from the animal world. And that's where he'll break down the components of the drive and its relationship to, sexuality, etc.
It's really interesting. I feel like there's a prehistory even to the concept of drive before psychoanalysis, obviously in the history of German idealism. And there is at the core of the understanding of the subject, right, the idea that unruly, there's a kind of element of an unruly passional domain that exceeds our rationality. And this irrational element of our subjectivity is one that philosophy needs to sort of conquer, or that the task of becoming a refined or even enlightened subject is to conquer this irrational element. And one of the interesting things about psychoanalysis, if you read like pre-Lacanian Freudians that are like, say, like Philip Rieff would be probably my favorite example, although there's others, they do not, they do use the term instinct when they translated Trieb into English. And they are of the view, but they're not trying to theorize that in a biological way. We'll get to that in a moment, why it's not necessarily reducible just to a biological category or function. But what they show is that, in fact, it's a kind of cultural, it has a cultural element where what the gift of psychoanalysis is to culture and civilization is that it becomes a method for that precise, wider task of conquering the irrational element inside of us. And in order to do that, according to Rieff, there's also an ethical dimension that Freud, and this is why Freud is to be understood as a continuation of Nietzsche, because ultimately, it's necessary to come to terms with the fact that the cosmos and the wider universe and our condition as humans is ultimately facing a non-transcendent, non-theistic, meaningless abyss of a horizon. But that's the hardest thing to come to terms with. Psychoanalysis helps us come to terms with that nothingness, right? Or that abyssal element. And that abyssal element is sort of connected to the irrational part of our subjectivity as well, right? So I've always been drawn to this idea and the ethics involved with relating to the irrational inside of us. And obviously, there's a lot of different philosophers. I think really after Schopenhauer, the so-called irrationalist philosophers and later the vitalist philosophers that really create a whole philosophical edifice based on some of these ideas. So I don't know if you've thought about that, like the prehistory of the concept of drive. I mean, we're just going to talk really more about how psychoanalysis looks at it and how Freud's approach to it is so distinctive. We'll get to that. But what would you say about the pre-psychoanalytic conceptions of drive?
No, it's so funny that you mentioned that. I think when you look at, and this is coming from Lacan, when you look at pre-psychoanalytic notions of drive and the unconscious, we see them in, as you said, people like Schopenhauer. Edward von Hartmann is the specific one who will use the term unconscious, like as in like will or creativity. And funny enough, like even though like you quoting Rieff, and I recommend this translation by Rieff of the metapsychological papers. It's really easy to read, especially for beginners. That this idea of the irrational principle within us, because like I mean, again, it's the difference in reading, but I kind of see Jung following the more irrationalist tradition compared to Freud. Now, it's not to say that there isn't a relationship between, let's say Nietzsche and Freud. I think that's probably accurate, but I feel like, in some sense, Jung takes the more pre-psychoanalytic concept of drive, will, and the unconscious. And what do I mean by that? Well, again, it's this like sort of technicality within the history of thought about the Copernican revolution, a Copernican shift in the universe, and the Ptolemaic model, where for Freud, the unconscious is not really a substance, it's not a metaphysical concept, but it's something in the discovery within the domain of science decenters the concept of man, right? We have Copernicus and Galileo who create the first paradigm shift by decentering the Earth. And then we have, of course, Kant's own Copernican revolution, and then Darwin decentering man from the animal kingdom and this idea of natural selection. But it's really Freud who delivers the final blow to the ego by showing that man is not even the master of his own temple, his own body. And so, I mean, again, like I think that there is the conditions for psychoanalysis in terms of like philosophical concepts of Trieb or will to power, or was it Schopenhauer's will to live, will to life? Again, von Hartmann and all the other romanticists. But I think it's Freud who is able to situate it at the level of inquiry when it comes to pathology. Um,
Yeah.
and that there is a sort of way to maneuver, if we want to use the term irrational nature within us, through the talking cure, right? Because we're not ultimately succumb to an irrationalist nature, which is also going to bring into question, is psychoanalysis a Weltanschauung? Is it a worldview? Because that's something that Freud also questioned himself.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think you could take it back to Plato's sort of tripartite structure of the self vis-a-vis the rational, the spirited, and the appetites, the kind of. But that's not exactly how Freud theorizes the drive, right? Freud does not, for example, argue that the drives are related or should be related to like hunger at this kind of level of primal need, right? Um, and so we'll explain that in a moment. But that's what's so interesting about them. And then there, of course, becomes the question as to whether we're dealing with a monistic conception of the drives or whether, in fact, we're dealing with a dualistic conception of the drives, namely the life drives and the death drives. And Lacan has a very particular reading of that. So I think that certainly as a precursor to psychoanalysis, you get a lot of, and Edward von Hartmann is an interesting figure in the sense that he's a precursor really to the conception of the unconscious. I'm not sure that he develops a conception of drives, but he does have some kind of irrational conception of the unconscious, right?
Well, if we use the term irrationalism in the way that Lukács would use it, you also have Kierkegaard, who develops the concept of repetition as well. That will become central to how Lacan will theorize the Freudian death drive and repetition. So I kind of find that interesting as well. Kierkegaard is a main figure for Lacan. Um, but yeah, I do agree with you, and I do like that you pointed out that like we don't reduce, at least for Freud, it's not reducible to appetites or hunger. Funny enough, like in the three essays, when he begins to talk about the sexual instinct, he gives an analogy to appetite and hunger and the object of nourishment to satisfy that. But it's sort of something that there is no language so far during his time to describe the sexual instinct, which would later then develop into his theory of the drive. And so like he talks about the way in which like, okay, if there is an object of sexual drive or sexual libido, which is the term he's actually using, libido, um, then it's not a correspondent. Actually a discordant between like its aim and its object of satisfaction. In fact, like you could see in culture that our civilization and the culture that is created from that, sexuality doesn't have the primacy of biological reproduction. In fact, it finds satisfaction in other ways, whether it's like in forms of fetishism, in forms of deviation. And he's also arguing against these sort of, you could say, uh, heteronormative and misogynist models of sexual science back then that would say that, oh, if you're a homosexual, you're a man, you have a woman's brain inside your body, and vice versa. If you're a lesbian, then you have a male brain, et cetera, et cetera. And he's just like, that could be further from the truth. In fact, despite some of the criticisms that feminists and psychoanalytic feminists have of Freud, you could at least like show that he isn't down to clown with like these early heteronormative models of sexuality. So by giving what we would call the polymorphous perverse nature of sexuality, which then again, it isn't reducible to hunger and it's not reducible to biology. And that's like the sort of question, what is the drive? What
Right.
is and libido for Freud?
Right, for sure. And I think that the philosopher that gets the closest to a robust account of the drives is Nietzsche, and his is grounded in a conception of a physiological idea of the human, but it's a very, I mean, this is why Nietzsche is like a precursor to this notion that the human subject is ultimately decentered from their rationality and that they're largely driven by impersonal drives. But he has a kind of, but then he tries to historicize the physiological basis of the drives into a wider conception of like the different typologies and like a kind of whole taxonomy and hierarchy of rank, right? Of rank order amongst the humans. And I would say it's like an incomplete conception of the drives, and frankly, founded off of a lot of like reactionary political agendas as well. But Freud, I think, is somewhat influenced by the kind of general Nietzschean sort of concepts that are in the air, let's say. So you've already given us a nice kind of beginning point with the 1905 essay up through the narcissism essay. Where this is most developed, of course, I think is in 1920 and Beyond the Pleasure Principle, where here we get a real full kind of position on the Freudian conception of the drive. And if I could I maybe invite you to stake out some of the kind of key concepts? And just as a little side point, we did our first study group on this whole YouTube platform, Emancipations, on Beyond the Pleasure Principle. It turned out pretty well, especially the second session. We got way into it. We just go line by line, but we analyze it with a bunch of secondary literature as well. So for anyone that's interested in that, I'll put a link to it in the show description. But Andrew, would you walk us through, if you don't mind?
Yeah, I'll also just say that's a really good reading group. I remember when I was still in the military, I was listening to that while like at work, working in the military warehouse. So I definitely recommend reading that for all anybody who's a newbie in psychoanalysis. And your one talk on sublimation was really good too. That's like a really, really old one. I don't know where it was at, the DC forums or something like that. Um, so yeah, your question regarding, beyond the pleasure principle, and it's interesting because to answer your very first question in the beginning of the talk, I had said that the blueprints of the drive can be found in three essays. When you read Seminar 2 of Lacan, I think that for me, in my reading of Lacan, that is the seminar of the drive, and specifically the death drive as it relates to beyond the pleasure principle. And the Seminar 1 is like about the imaginary, narcissism, libido, etc., and transference. But what's interesting about beyond the pleasure principle is that we get Freud, who returns to his earlier model, Freud number one, which is the topography of the consciousness perception system, the preconscious domain, and the unconscious proper. Not only do we get that, but we get a revised version of what he calls the primary and secondary processes, also known as the pleasure principle and the reality principle. And these are important not only to understand the drive, but also to understand sexuality and these sort of dual drives, dual instincts. So we should also understand Freud with this question regarding reality and the loss of reality for the neurotic. This is seen as early as the project of scientific psychology. And for Lacan, he will say that we could see the drive as early as that 1896 rough draft that was never published during his time. It's translated as Project for Scientific Psychology. In German, it's called the Entwurf. Why is this important? So when we understand this idea of drive, or even Freud up until 1920, Freud thinks that the pleasure principle is meant to resolve a lot of things when it comes to excitation, nervous energy, psychic suffering, and that the pleasure principle or the primary process is what's the governing mechanism of the unconscious. We seek for homeostasis, and by homeostasis, it's never going to be a pure equilibrium like in the sort of Darwinian evolutionary model or the biology of his time. Rather, it's for the best possible state of tension or the least uh, state of tension, right? And he thinks that up until 1920, one of the ways that we could see the pleasure principle operate is through psychoanalysis. When the neurotic comes in, they lie on the couch and they talk about their fixations uncensored. Um, and he'll say in the beginning of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, when I first, I'm paraphrasing, but when I first started to undergo this investigation of psychoanalytic technique, I thought that this art was helpful because it could resolve tension through the act of free association and the position of the analyst as interpreting, right? This would also be to make what is unconscious conscious. Funny enough, all of Freud's students and everybody after Freud did not take this point at heart when he said this is not viable or attainable because of this discovery of the death drive. Even people like Wilhelm Reich, when they talk about psychoanalysis, their first thing is the principle of making what is unconscious conscious. We also see this in Jung. We see this in many people. The only person who does not adhere to that tenet is our Lord and Savior Lacan. I'm just kidding. But he then talks about looking at resistances
You
and to
could
position.
argue that Ferenczi also has a
Yeah.
premonition of this too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Frenzy is somebody that I need to study more, but Frenzy's legit from what I've read. Frenzy, there's a lot of good like students when you look at the first generation of Freud, right?
Well, Lacan does, I think, incorporate some of Ferenczi's methodologies,
Yeah.
uh, especially in the question of the position of the analyst.
Yeah.
There's other within the inner circle of the Freudians. I think that perhaps figures like Hans Sachs,
Yeah.
Ferenczi, and others may have been able to capture this
Okay.
insight, but it's a very, very significant point. Please go on.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know if you can hear my cat in the background, but he's meowing. I think he's agreeing. But yeah, so then like, we look at resistances in the transference, which is an important concept, and we'll talk about that because it does relate to the drive. And then we look at how no matter what, these only do so much because even to situate resistance and the way that it makes the analyzand not want to talk in certain ways to encounter the unconscious and what is repressed, that we can't remember all that's repressed. Memory, there's a difference between memory and remembering, and we can only remember so much. And in actuality, when you get deep in analysis, sometimes patients repeat more than what they remember. They repeat, they act out, and they do a lot of things that are indicative of this death drive element, um, rather than working through and integrating, etc. And this comes up in again a revision to Freud's theory of the pleasure principle, because one of the ways that the pleasure principle can also find homeostasis besides free association is in the wish fulfillment mechanism in the dreams. So you have, something that is unattainable. You are suffering it through life, but yet when you fall asleep, the processes of the unconscious are creating these mechanisms of condensation, of displacement, of a wish fulfillment, or a fulfilling of the wish. Even if it's not you, you're embodying some type of like persona in the dream, which is in some sense fulfilling that satisfaction. And so to bring that out into talking life, or the analytic free association, is another way to bring light to what these dreams are saying. And through enough psychoanalysis, according to Freud, we would be able to find that best possible tension, or that homeostatic model. But we realized that from two things during the time that he was writing this, it's post World War One. We're almost, going into like World War Two. We see, as it was called back then, shell shock. Now we call it PTSD, and this idea of war neuroses. That in fact we don't see the psychoanalytic method for neurotics aiming at that best possible tension, or wish fulfillment. In fact, now dreams have that nightmare effect, where it's not even satisfying that wish fulfillment; it's repeating nightmares in various forms.
So
So
let's pause on this. I love this
yeah.
point because this is so excellent. So like the idea could be summarized in another way as it's also known as the repetition compulsion, but to sort of translate what that means, one of the ways to think about it is that we revisit these unfinished repressed scenes. We go back to them, say in dreams, but also in free association, right? That's a lot of what happens, is revisiting of scenes and so on. um Not necessarily to find some homeostasis there. No, in fact, they're impossible zones, impossible scenes in a certain way, impossible precisely to have some great harmony there. But still, we go back to them. Why? Here I would posit, and this is like one kind of rationalist interpretation of Freud, let's call it, that what's going on there is the drive is aiming towards a type of mastery of its scene, of its environment, of its conditions, as well as of its psychic prehistory, right? And I've always thought that that's actually a pretty useful way to think about it, which you could even take out and abstract as a kind of political project of psychoanalysis, right? Whereby if we think about collective neuroses in social life that weigh us down, right? Whether that be through an association to a group of people, to a class, etc., are we not replaying that same revisitation of the traumatic scene, right? Like I'm thinking here of this beautiful essay by Fred Moten called Aunt Hester's Scream, which is a reading of Frederick Douglass's the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, where he has a recollection of the scream of his aunt when she's getting whipped by the slave master. And it's this very traumatic scene. But Fred Moten says this was the scene where Frederick Douglass became an artist, because the only way he could handle revisiting it and therefore mastering the traumatic excess that it produced, namely hearing it as a child and how alarming and terrible it was by sublimating it through art, by becoming basically like an intellectual in the broad sense. And I felt that's a very interesting way. And here I've already introduced sublimation, which we'll get to in a minute because it's very, very much related here. But would you agree, Andrew, that the drive also could be understood? Because it's not, when we say death drive, I think sometimes people get this sense that it's like some element of our unconscious, which is fully outside of us or for which we have no rational control over or something like that. To some extent, yes. But don't you think also that one of the interesting things about the repetition compulsion and the drive is that it is our attempt to create a scene of mastery of our psychic histories?
Yes. Yeah, that's so beautiful. And I agree. And when you look at like Freud on his own and the way he's tethering with this concept, as well as somebody, though inspired and taught by Lacan, does not use the Lacanian terminology, but just the exegetical method of reading Freud and Laplanche, you could see that for Freud, it is the scene of returning to master it. Again, going back to Kierkegaard's repetition work, it's like him going back to what is it? The character is, I think, goes back to Berlin and recounts every single step where he experienced like extreme pleasure, but like he doesn't get the same effect. In fact, he gets something different, right? It's something that's returning to because it's left unfinished. As Lacan will talk about, this is important for psychoanalysis because it's what's called the Zeigarnik effect, right? That you always want to replay and revisit something that's left unfinished, right? Which is why it's important for analysts in the treatment at certain moments that the analysand doesn't try to make too much meaning of something they're encountering, but leave it scansioned or cut right there, only to return to an unfinished thing. Um, uh, so like when we look at Freud, right, it's at this level of the scene. For Laplanche and Laplanchian, who I appreciate a lot, Avgi Sakatopoulou, she's a great psychoanalyst in her work. She talks about like this aspect of traumatophilia, which I believe comes from Laplanche, which is to invest into in the traumatic, not in the sense that you fetishize it or you love it, but that your infidelity to the analytic treatment, because when you revisit these unconscious scenes that the drive is trying to recreate. And I think you mentioned scenes like primal scenes in that friend Moten example. We should understand that the drive has a relationship to the primal scene, the primal fantasy, etc. That something new is associated. You don't repeat the same exact thing. In fact, even Freud says in, I want to say, the end of chapter 5 or 6 of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, that's not enough for the agent to repeat the same thing in mastering the scene, but that like something of novelty comes about, right? And again, like when we talk about like the scene, we should always think of like how when Freud is trying to understand this repetition compulsion and death drive element, he looks at his grandson as a sort of anecdotal experience, the famous Fort Da kid who like
Right.
when his mother's leaves him with Freud, there's the scene of separation from the mother.
Right.
So the child is playing with toys, casting them away and refinding them, and making these sort of noises and associations with them, and Freud translate them as like Fort and Da, that this is a repetition of trying to symbolically inscribe a place where the unconscious is trying to rework that process to master it, but it always goes unfinished, and it needs to be unfinished for the drive to continue to create that scene over and over again,
Right.
right?
It reminds me of the Edge of Tomorrow with Tom Cruise, the 2014 film, where it's like they're in that futuristic war against the aliens, and they've found a time loop where they can go back and repeat a very particular battle, which is like D-Day, but it's in the future. Um, does this ring a bell? Emily Blunt is in it.
I actually have
And
not seen that. No, I know of it though.
yeah, it's a very Freudian film. But this is interesting, right? Because in a way, one of the things that happens in psychoanalytic contexts is sometimes words trigger an association to this scene that then can unlock this kind of repetition, which before was maybe restrained or repressed. So this introduces us to the dark side of psychoanalysis, in the sense that it's inviting you to a discover in your field of speech the tableau of the points where you might begin to investigate or reinvestigate these scenes, whether they're primal scenes or whatever have you. I've always thought about it like maybe like those two levels, and even um, what's the concept in Freud, acceranto movebo, of going down into the depths in 1900 interpretation of dreams. It's the same. It's the same kind of concept, right? With the drive. And the other thing I wanted to invite you to perhaps say something about is, why does Freud refer to the drive as a sadistic drive in Beyond the Pleasure Principle? I think this is a very important, why sadism there?
So it's so interesting because he'll say that in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, and he'll also give the sadistic quality to it in Civilization and its Discontent. But I want to say it's 1923. I always get the dates mixed up. It's the mid 20s, where he has this essay called "The Economic Problem of Masochism." And so I think this is Freud juggling with two, you could say, primal elements of the drive, which in a sense gives clarity to the polymorphous perverse nature of the libido and the sexual quality and quantity of it. And so I think Freud in Beyond the Pleasure Principle would give the sadistic quality to it because of its the way that it has an aggressive nature and the way that its aggressivity could display itself on towards the other person. And of course we will see that in Civilization is Discontent, where culture and these institutions are a way to channel the death drive as aggression towards our neighbor, right? This is why he's not a fan of the Saint Francis of Assisi, love thy neighbor as the Christian, love thy neighbor as thyself, but he's targeting Francis of Assisi specifically. But the economic problem of masochism is one that kind of, I think, oscillates because and it kind of puts into light, the sadist nature, because while there is the sadistic element and the aggression that comes with that, um, it could turn onto its opposite and become masochistic. Like, you know, the sadist doesn't seek a masochist, just like the masochist person doesn't seek the sadist. They need to seek something to fulfill their satisfaction at the level of the drive. And talking about the primal scene, this is where these two aspects of the drive, sadism and masochism, arise as early as childhood, right? We should see this not perverse in the Lacanian sense as clinical structure, but we could see this as perverse trait, because even a neurotic, an obsessional, or a hysteric in their primal scene, in their fantasy, can have a sadistic or a masochistic trait to their fantasy life, and even the way that that informs sexuality. So, like, again, to reiterate, I think Freud sees sadism as one because he calls the drive demonic, and I know Laplanche will kind of like run with that a bit. But then in the later 1920s, he talks about this, problem of masochism as like the way the drive imposes itself on the subject itself. But we could also see him talk about that as early as 1917 in Instincts and Their Vicissitudes, because he talks about, again, like to really break down what the drive is, it's got four components. You have, in the essay, he breaks it down. You have the impetus, as it's translated by what is it, Philip Rieff, and I think Strachey, but I think it's better to talk about it as a thrust, or pulsion in French. But and that just means that like it's sort of mechanical motion, it's tendency. In a Lacanian sense, it's almost like static tension. Even though there's motion, it kind of never moves. In a sense, it's the Lacanian that which returns to its place, you know? And I always had this question, and I wrote it down in my notes. In the Lacanian sense, is the thrust or impetus of the drive constituted or constituted by the mechanism of desire and demand, insofar as the desire is the other's desire and it is a fundamental lack and alienation, and the demand, which has a relationship to the splitting of the subject, right? I know that's a lot of Lacanian jargon that I threw out for our learners and listeners. But then we have for Freud, another element of the drive. So the first one was the thrust or impetus. We have then the aim, and aim is going to be very important. The aim is just satisfaction, right? um and it's of course of a sexual nature. But in the neurotic, we also have this idea of aim inhibition. And this we could see aligned with an earlier reference to libido and the drive in the three essays. In the second essay on infantile sexuality, he talks about reaction formation and sublimation. A reaction formation, I believe, in my opinion, is what creates the nucleus of sexuality or the drive, which is this erogenous zone of the body, i.e., the oral, the anal, the in Lacanian scopic, and the invocatory, right? And that's actually the source. So the erogenous zone is the source, which is the third concept, right, of the drive or third component. And so these interrelate because the source is where the drive is going to come from, right? And the reaction formation can be one of early infancy, like disgust or shame or guilt, when something creates a very erotic sensation on that body part or organ, right? And that's at least for Freud. I'm using the Freudian terms. And you could see how that would create a sexual amnesia or repression, especially for the hysteric. That comes back in bodily conversions. Or it could have a sense of shame and guilt for the young boy who will become and destined to be an obsessional neurotic, and will feel guilty and express this sexual excitation in solitude by masturbating, etc. I always make this like joke, like, or like, it's this common trope, not even a joke, of like, when the young boy is like home all alone and he's curious and he goes through daddy's dresser and finds Playboy magazines. This is an example of you could say, a reaction formation at the level of the eyes or the gaze that could bring a sense of excess, but also guilt and shame and fear of being punished by the father for enjoying too much. So we could see reaction formation and the possibility of inhibition, right? So the three, again, impetus or thrust, the source, and the aim, right, which is satisfaction. And the last one is the object, right? And the object is not a real thing. It's actual, we could say in Deleuze in terms of virtual, or it's the object that's always refound because it's a lost object. It's a lacking object in the Lacanian sense. And the object varies because really the object is dependent on what the aim is oriented around, right? In the Oedipus complex, you can't enjoy your mother, so you have to find a new object of satisfaction, right? So then we get aim becoming sublimated into something new at the level of courtly love. So that's what we have to. I know I said a lot. I'm not sure if you have anything to add right there, but that's kind of like how we should see drive and sexuality and libido at that point. And the sadomasochistic element comes from the fact of like, is this reaction formation giving one the ability to impose that sexual excitation and even aggression onto the object or the person? Or is it going to be something as early as me wanting it onto myself, right? There's like, these tropes of like the devouring mother, right? And like, wanting to enjoy the mother too much that, you have this enjoyment of being punished because you're doing something incestuous or too wrong in the sort of Freudian paradigm. But masochism could also be punishment by the father in the myth of the primal horde. Sadism could be parricide in this fantasy. Someone like Gerard Poirier, another student of Lacan and French psychoanalyst, talks about I think it's three fundamental fantasies. You have the primal scene of like a child is being beaten, right? You have the parricide, and you have the scene of seduction, right? And all of those can have a quality of masochism or sadism to them as early as that, but it doesn't make one a pervert. It's just that's the early constitution of sexuality.
Nice. Yeah, no, that's really good. So I think these four elements to the drive are interesting, and what's very interesting about them is that they all compose a kind of non-totalizing logic. This is sort of to the notion of vicissitudes, meaning that the idea of the partial object is, I think, essential in understanding the direction of like how this drive is aiming for a satisfaction, which is destined to not reach homeostasis, not have a perfect sense of harmony or completion, or it's like this, you know, for Marxists, you'll be aware of this in like the critique that Marx and Engels have of like Fourier, who assumed that like the utopian commune would be capable of producing an economic form of exchange that would eliminate all forms of aggression entirely, right? So there's this psychoanalytic insight into this kind of utopian harmonious idea of subjectivity, which is very essential. And I think Todd McGowan is one of our best political thinkers at extending this psychoanalytic insight into political and social domains, where the whole conception of utopia has to be rethought. Now, the four elements are good. So there is the source, this kind of pulsional. Now, the pulsional dimension is important to understand because this is where Freud says the drive is connected to myth and to mythology, meaning that an element within us is of something infinite and immortal. So when you have a philosopher like Alain Badiou who can say that there's an element of our subjectivity which is not spiritually immortal, but at this kind of interstitial between the spiritual and the corporeal, at this psychoanalytic level of drive, this knowing neither night or day, rise or fall, spring or autumn, this pulsional element of the drive, this constant element of the drive, brings us into a dialogue with the Greeks. I would say, Andrew, this is part of the rationale as to why Freud can reanimate for modern man a conversation with Sophocles and Aeschylus, right? Because there's an element of our subjectivity which affirms this kind of infinite plane of becoming. But again, it's an infinite plane of becoming, which is not based on this kind of model of homeostatic simplicity and so on. So it's a very fascinating sort of four-part thing. So then the other element, of course, is the source. Now here we could say the polymorphous perverse subject of the erogenous zones each have a form of relationality of drive, right? Lacan will say that every erogenous zone ultimately is structured along the logic of the death drive. And I wonder if you might want to say a few things about that. I know you've studied this particular point in Lacanian thought, and maybe you might elucidate a little bit more about that. And then we'll go back and we'll talk about the other two. Would you say something about that, though?
Yeah, I mean, if it's not too long-winded, I'll try to be concise. But this also brings up like again what you talked about with the monism of libido and the drive versus the dualism that Freud will posit, because the monism is going to be championed by Jung, right? And Jung wants to disinvest from the sexual nature. And this debate between the monism versus the dualism of the drive starts as early as 1914 and 15, when Freud develops the narcissism essay. This is because there's a question regarding psychosis, and Freud obviously, one of his failures is he thinks that, psychoanalysis serves no purpose for the psychotic, and especially someone like Schreber. Of course, Lacan would disagree, and I think for obvious reasons. In fact, one of our colleagues and friends, Michael McAndrew, said that honestly, I feel like psychoanalysis is wasting something so extraordinary and good on neurotics when it could be useful for psychotics who have no place in the world today. And I think that's true. It's that's just a side tangent. But Jung worked with schizophrenics, right? And he believes that, ultimately that libido, sure, it may start off as early in childhood as, a sexual nature, but it matures and develops over time to become psychically invested. That libido is ultimately psychic. And, we could see this in relationship to his collective unconscious and his even conception of the world, right? As having this like relationship of psychic energy, right? Freud would disagree with that, and Freud
Right.
sees drive as sexual, yet the ego instinct aspect is going to be the sort of desexualized. Now,
Right.
this,
And just so quickly, that
yeah,
dovetails nicely with what I was saying about this kind of
yeah,
idea that libido does not contain an element of eros, which is composed of some substance that is like, like Wilhelm Reich would argue, of the
mhm,
organ, or
the
like
organ,
of some. What Wilhelm Reich argued was that it's the libido has an element which defies um, entropy,
hmm,
which
hmm, yeah,
exceeds the logic of entropy, and therefore, uh, yeah, he thought that you could circumvent death
yeah,
drive in a
yeah.
certain way, right?
Yeah, what is it? It's the muscular tension buildup. There's the discharge, and then there's vegetation, right? Of his model.
Yeah, it's super interesting, but yeah, I guess one of the things that is very important to understand about the core psychoanalytic theory of this subject is like in the Nietzschean conception, but I think even more scientifically rigorous, is the polymorphous origin of this drive-based subject. And we know this from like Lacan's, or conception of the mirror stage, um, becomes the starting point of our subjectivity. And then it becomes interesting because at that point it's like the same dialectic we were talking about of irrationalism and rationalism, where how do we come to have some type of mastery over um, this kind of otherwise fragmented sense of the subject, right? I wonder if you might say a little bit more about the polymorphous perversity basis here of the drives and the body.
Yes. So slowing down a bit, because I still want to answer your question about like the whole thing, how we get into Lacan talking about like no matter what these four fundamental aspects of the drive, whether it's like oral, anal, scopic, and invocatory, that it's ultimately death drive, right? So one thing we have to remember, because it's not just the polymorphous perverse. I think really what that just entails, because I know like someone like Deleuze and Guattari will really ontologize polymorphous perversity and see this as like a sort of ontology and metaphysics of becoming and assemblage theory. Also multiplicity, consistent multiplicity. It's not just polymorphously perverse. Really, that to me, to dumb it down, is just Freud's argument to show that hey, human sexuality is not solely aimed at human reproduction. In fact, sexuality can find multiple objects and various aims throughout you know human development from childhood or from as early as like infancy to childhood to adolescence, and then recollected in adult life, right? When they go back on the couch. Funny enough, he never really analyzed children to find where these polymorphous perverse drives, these masturbatory instances were. These were all from patients, adult patients, recounting their sexual life from the unveiling of repression, insofar as it's, you know, uncensored and unmoored through speech in the analytic process, through fantasies, daydreams, and dreams. The main thing about the sexuality, though, is the autoerotic tendency, right? Autoerotism is the foundation, even when it moves into narcissism or into what Freud will call object cathexis, or sometimes called object love, that there is still an autoerotic element, right? That means that there is some element of the body that is really enjoyed. So even though we have a circuit of the drive where it's like it's source and then you have an object, ultimately it's not about the object, but about the excitation itself. We see Freud talk about this in Three Essays when he talks about the act of thumb sucking, right? Really, the thumb, the breast, or a pacifier. Sure, these are various types of
Or
objects.
even eating food.
Even eating food, right? Um, it's not the object, it's the sort of mode in which the erogenous zone could find satisfaction. He
Correct.
says,
Exactly.
if the mouth could, it would kiss itself. That's the
Well, I guess that the
autoerotic.
point is there's a degree of autoeroticism, but also therefore a kind of lack of autonomy that we as whatever conscious ego-centered agents have over these
Mhm.
zones. So yes, there is this ludic liberatory way of treating that I think you're right to call it ontologized. But I'm more of the view that the Oedipus complex becomes a method for,
Mhm. Mhm.
in part, right, providing some um, structure beyond that. We could get to that in a moment as well. But
Yeah.
please, yeah, go on.
Yeah, I mean, and it's also funny because like Jacques-Alain Miller, Lacan's son-in-law, he says in his, I think it's the probably the best Miller I've ever read. It's hands down my favorite. Also helped me in my personal life when it comes with relationships. Not that psychoanalysis helps anybody with relationships, right? But it's called the theory of the partner. And he gives this example towards the middle to the end of the text, where he says there is a paradox when it comes to sexuality and the drive. Of course, we should understand that it's autoerotic, by its nature, but that we need the other to ignite that mechanism of the drive circuit to begin with. And that's where the other as caregiver comes in, with the breast, with the pacifier, and then that the erogenous zone and its autoerotic tendencies can be ignited. It's like the watchmaker who twists the thing and then the gears could go. I kind of like metaphorize it like that. Sure, it's autoerotic and it's kind of like self-contained, but it still needs the other to kind of ignite that gear for it to start working. And then because of socialization, we end up, sublimating or finding new ways to enjoy, whether it be in the Oedipus complex or in, the narcissist thing. And you mentioned Oedipus complex. It's also important to know that this is not just happening at the level of an isolated individual. Again, the earliest form of socialization is the family unit. Now, I know you've written so much on the family, so you could probably add to that. But sticking in Freud's paradigm, um, there's there's an element that kind of goes missing in a lot of theories of Freud, and even like deviated by other forms of psychoanalysis that are not Freudian or Lacanian. Someone like Laplanche is perfect to kind of bring this point out. When we think of the drive, when we think of sexual libido, we also have to think of the theory of attachment, right? Because attachment goes haywire and it becomes more of a sort of like psychobiological thing, where like a child seeks warmth. I think that's like Bowlby is the Anglo-American psychoanalyst that talks about this. But Freud's theory of attachment has two modes. You have the what's called the anaclitic relationship, and then you have the narcissistic relationship. The analytic relationship is where the child is receiving the form of love or the gift of love by the caregiver, and that can transform something autoerotic into the object love because they're learning how to be loved, right? So even in the Oedipus complex, like that's how that's worked through. But then you have the narcissistic, which is the love for one's own body or the enjoyment of one's own body as a sexual satisfaction. Now, the interesting thing is that while narcissism can be a problem, the narcissist actually loves, right? He loves himself or she loves herself. They love themselves through the body of the other, and they project that image of themselves onto the other. Whereas the anaclitic relationship is one of wanting to be loved. Now, why the aspect of love is important is because this is where Freud gets very cryptic, and we need Lacan for that. The drive, no matter what, its satisfaction will be that of love, right? And there's a distinction between love and hate at the level of the drive, and how we see other people talk about love and hate as affect, right? Because that's when we get into the problem of the transference. We're dealing with affect, right? We're dealing with, in Lacanian terms, something symbolic and even real, and that's when we get into the level of the drive, right? The satisfaction of repeating through love or through hate, etc.
Yeah. No, that's really good. So we've laid out the 4 levels of the drive, I think, really well, right? So we have this pulsional thrust element, this mythical dimension, which is like, there's a whole interesting dimension there that exceeds chronological or linear time. There's the source of the drive, the erogenous zones, for example. There's the object that the drive is aiming towards, and then there is the aim. Now let's talk about the aim, because we kind of already hinted at it. But what I find so interesting about psychoanalysis, and this is sort of becomes the basis for like a lot of like very counterintuitive insights that psychoanalysis can offer, I think, in general, which is that, maybe perhaps to understand that one's pursuits have a kind of self-referential element to them, or in other words, it's not so much about the attainment of the object, but it's about the satisfaction that comes with aiming towards it. And that could be seen and interpreted in a lot of different ways. Right? So like in sports, we often think no matter what, whether we win or lose, it's about discovering this aspect of the play itself, and we go to just imbibe that moment, right? That's kind of a cheap example, but you could apply it to so many different domains. And this is where sublimation comes into play, because sublimation becomes this strange, unfulfilled strategy that doesn't give you the object. It doesn't give you the final, the pudding of the cake. It doesn't give you like the sweet spot, but it satisfies in the act of doing it, or it also displaces elements of the act which are painful or which are negative in some way, right? So for example, work, like we relate to work on a daily basis vis-a-vis, we have to relate to work vis-a-vis cultivating some strategy of sublimating that work. Otherwise, the kind of brute horror of like the object of what we're engaged with, without that sublimatory exit, like work would actually be a horrific thing. So I want to invite you to say perhaps a little bit about the aim, satisfaction, and how you understand the theory of sublimation. I know famously a lot of people will say that sublimation is an unfinished. I gave a whole talk on sublimation. My conclusion was like, it's the one psychoanalytic concept that's the least definitive.
Yeah, I don't know if you follow Dr. Jason Childs. He's a Lacanian analyst. out of France, and I was in one of his introductory courses, and he said something to the lines of that the pervert in the Lacanian sense is always sublimating. And that's why, like, even though there is a sexual quality, their enjoyment, whether masochistic or sadistic, voyeur exhibitionist, um, can go beyond just the sexual act. For the neurotic, it's like they have problems sublimating because there's so much inhibition in them. When you look at Freud, right, we have sublimation, and from what I understand, like this most like stereotypical Freud, it's like that of desexualization. And so, like, for instance, all that sexual energy can transform into a work of art, right? Is the most like iconic example, or literature. Um, and like you mentioned sports, and I like to think that, like, in a sense, like, MMA and combat sports are a form of sublimation, as far as, like, yeah, maybe it's not sexual, but like there is a form of, like, aggression, and maybe something death driven, but that doesn't mean that it's what you could say, like, healthy, because we see that, in a sense, there is something phallic to mainstream combat sports. We see people like John Jones getting arrested for multiple DUIs and domestic violence. And even though he's the champion, he's the man, there's something, regardless of sublimation, that's still going on at the level of excess, right? Sublimation is still about handling one's excess, I think, as
True,
well.
true, true, true.
Like, even like what is it, Mike Tyson, he talked about like how he would embody this like other persona, this like shadow figure when he goes into fight, and like channels all his like dark past, but he still end up in prison because of just like
So
the amount of aggression.
no,
um
I like it. I just want to say I want to add one element here, um, which is you've done a nice job of showing that the stakes of sublimation are about a treatment or a dealing with the sexual aspect of the drive. But I think also they can only be understood through culture. And culture introduces an investment into a new object, or like an object which is not the object of the drive per se, but that's actually what sublimation names. I would define it like that. And I wonder if you agree, Andrew. And this is why, by the way, a lot of theorists, and here I'm talking about like philosophers of psychoanalysis, have put forward the argument, including Lacan himself, that late capitalism, like our own time, is one in which sublimation no longer works. And that has to do with a deprivation in the reservoir of cultural symbols that are available to us in order to make sublimation happen. So I do want to introduce the cultural. Would you agree and build on that?
yeah, I mean, I haven't touched too much on the cultural domain, but that's interesting that, like, I've never heard that about capitalism not allowing sublimation to work, or that sublimation no longer works. And maybe the fact it's like because in the Lacanian sense, you have this idea of the deterioration of a social bond within the
Yeah,
capitalist
yeah.
discourse, that it's like it's hard for us to sublimate, because that would mean to create a culture. And I think this is where we have to be more Marxist to like understand the distinction between bourgeois culture and maybe like a proletariat culture, and like in the making. That's something that I'm not as well read as you, but I feel like there could be an argument for that. I think that like goes back to our conversation about a different type of group other than the artificial group from like Rose Itchner, and the culture that would come through that, and if sublimation would be possible. But I do want to circle back to Lacan in terms of sublimation, because I think Lacan gives us a different reading, because he will talk about sublimation in depth in Seminar 7, but it's in relation to the object, right? Especially the Das Ding, right? And that to sublimate is to elevate the object, of satisfaction to the dignity of the thing, right? But
The
in
the
Seminar
ordinary, the
the
ordinary.
ordinary, yeah, the ordinary, right? But I think in Seminar 11, and then his recapitulation of Seminar 7 in the chapter I had you read, Two Sides of Sublimation, in Seminar
Yeah,
16, he focuses on the aim, right? And I think the aim is important because we could think of Freud describing drive as tendency, like the drive always has a tendency to like aim at satisfaction, but it's always inhibited. But regardless of the inhibition and the need to sublimate, that Lacan will see the drive as going adrift, right? But even if it goes adrift from its object, that nevertheless it still finds satisfaction. So it's the question of the aim versus the object. And so he thinks that, if I recount him correctly, that in a sense sublimation has something equal and different to sexual satisfaction. And that's why he says in Seminar 11, it's the moment that I'm not fucking that I'm talking to you. And at the same time, I still get a similar satisfaction talking to you if I were fucking. So the question is, am I fucking you right now? Right. Well, the point of that funny, hilarious, because Lacan is just, he's just too much. The point is that, like, he wants to show that, I think it's not just the fact that, like, sublimation at the level of like free association can be enjoyable, like, a sexual act. What he's trying to say is that there's something excessive that can only be funneled through the nomination, right? Not just that you're talking, but the nomination of the desire, the nomination and naming, what one's symptom is. And naming doesn't mean that there's meaning, because when we think of the complexity of Lacan, we talk about jouissance, and how jouissance, which is his rendition of the affective drive, is not at the level of sense or nonsense. So I think in some sense, he's neither calling Freud a rationalist or an irrationalist, but regardless of the senseless and even absence of sense of sex and jouissance, that there is a logic. Even if it doesn't make sense, there's still a logic to the drive, right? And that's why Lacan's always obsessed with logic. He's obsessed with Aristotle, the Gödel stuff, and logical time. Regardless if it's a sophism, it still creates a sort of a logical loop, right? And that's how he sees drive and possibly sublimation, in my opinion.
Wow. So let's go back to this cultural dimension, because I think you referenced a very well-known passage from Lacan's ethics seminar, which we can kind of repeat and try to flesh out, which is the definition of sublimation is the elevation of the ordinary object to status of something more grandiose, or kind of like his idea of the matchbook, which I think I've shared on the show before, is a good case in point, which is that if you take an ordinary matchbook that you get at a bar, well, if you put that onto the wall and you just like put a thumbtack into it, the difference between it sitting on the ground and it now being on the wall is kind of like a definition of sublimation for how the woman was treated in the era of the Renaissance, at the time of Shakespeare, Cervantes, and so on. This is how the lady was to be elevated. Now, if we think about this operation within the sphere of our daily life, I'm even thinking like psychopathology of everyday life, what would it mean to think sublimation as, and here I'm almost thinking sublimation as like some variation of coping with the drudgery of day-to-day labor. And I wonder what you would think about that. Like, in other words, is sublimation not a bit like that, in the sense that it's a kind of strategy for creating an investment in something which is otherwise too difficult or too ordinary to face? So does it also then entail a level of using your own fantasy in a way? Maybe it does, in the sense that how does one create an identification or a projection? Is that because, you see, when I said that sublimation is no longer common in our culture, Lacan develops a neologism to define it, which you may remember, Andrew. It's called the escabeau, right? And that refers to the soapbox. So now in our public sphere, and Jacques-Alain Miller is huge on this, there's no sublimation anymore, because the register of otherness no longer allows us to invent a scene of identification that would be anything other than our own enjoyment. So ultimately, our own narcissistic sphere of enjoyment prevents us from creating sublimatory strategies, I guess you could say. What do you think about that argument? And again, let me stress that this is notional, and I'm not even sure that, like, I think this is just one way to think about what sublimation is as a cultural level. What would you say to that, though?
Yeah, I still think that there is the element of culture that we can't leave out when it comes to sublimation, because we just create culture. And, it had me thinking about, because you mentioned labor, and it seems like, with workers, they even getting, not even talking about like Jacqueline Malaire's like whole argument, but just like looking at like the everydayness of workers, it's as if they don't really have the ability, or they don't have the conditions that would allow them to create some sublimatory culture because of exploitation of labor. And this is where I, despite being a sort of self-proclaimed Althusserian, I like the 1844 Marx when he talks about what is a political economy, reducing the worker to a mouth and a stomach. And in a sense, like, sure, like we have more, technology that kind of alleviates certain like physical manual labor than it used to back then in Marx's time. But, even when we have time to socialize, there's no culture of sublimation. Um, there's also the element within the capitalist discourse of Lacan of isolation and loneliness, where there is no social bond, so there is no other. And this leads me to my more like general point, which is more psychoanalytic than it is political. But I think really, when it comes to sublimation, one of the effective ways to do that, psychoanalytically speaking, is to love, right? And this means to introduce the other and to give them what you do not have, right? Which also imprints the element of desire, right? And of course, that works psychoanalytically. When you undergo analysis, you learn how to love. You learn how to give up what doesn't work anymore, and also what you don't have, right? And introduce the difference of the other, and also the alterity of yourself. It's a different form of love than the history of love and romance, and of courtly love. But this is the kind of radicality that I think the psychoanalytic notion of love is in when working through one symptom, which is different than when you don't know what the other's jouissance is or enjoyment, but you're so fixated on it, then you use the concept of love as a sort of supplement, which can
Yeah,
be, in a sense, an imaginary. Well, Lacan will use another neologism, enamoration, like hate love, right? Um, but psychoanalytically, when you're able to give up what you don't have and love in that sense, I think maybe there could be something like sublimation in culture. Um,
I think another way to think about this would be through a social communal bond that
mhm,
is,
mhm.
that is constructed beyond um, the reign of technological instrumentalization, like the smartphone and what Lacan in the 17th seminar will refer to as this kind of alienating sphere, where technological objects have like a pure mastery over our subjectivity. It's in that condition where sublimation falls apart. But what I'm trying to theorize is what social bond allows for constructive and efficacious sublimatory opportunities. Because in a way, this takes us back to like the utopian socialist theory of like, okay, well, what is a communist society and why would work be more pleasurable than work is in capitalism? And you can't simply say, well, it's just because it's going to be less time. And that's a part of it. That's a part of it. But you see, I think sublimation is interesting because it's a field that allows for us to think about the construction of more meaningful I don't know, it's almost like the insertion of the mythical or the fantastical into the everyday, or something like extraordinary into the everyday. That's what I think of as sublimation, right? Which is trying to approach elements of social life which necessitate repetition, like labor. Because keep in mind, in Civilization is Discontents, one of Freud's, I think, great misreadings of communism is that he seems to think that communism posits labor as non-antagonistic and non-aggressive, as utopian, as this like homogenous thing that we enter into in a naive way.
And private property is the source of aggression.
And
right.
well,
That's like
yeah,
how you read it.
but also competition and private property are necessary elements so long as we have a kind of social democratic backdrop to them. Because I don't think that Freud would be a neoliberal, right? I think Freud is basically like a social democrat capitalist in his social vision. But part of that would be, well, what would a communist society look like that would A, allow for that reduction in work time, but B, fully accept this constitutive condition that psychoanalysis presents of this impossible repetition and impossible fulfillment of pure satisfaction, that we start the social contract with full knowledge that nothing like that's possible, right? Sublimation is something there that's almost I don't know, like so interesting because it's so I don't know. I'm totally freestyling here with you on this. And it's something that I've studied a lot, but
well, one of the things that you mentioned too, and I got sidetracked talking about like, culture and sublimation, but it still relates, is that when we go back again to the infamous Civilization and Discontent, you mentioned like sublimation as like almost like something of a coping strategy, or maybe, but like again, this is what Freud was getting at with Civilization, because one of the main opiates is religion, right? And Rosicner goes in depth, and we talked about this in our last conversation, but one of the ways which modern man tries to alleviate suffering with techniques are science and art, right? But science and art can only do so much. And then love, which is our relations with other men and women, etc., become almost equally, if not greater, in terms of the degree of unbearability. Like we can't, bear, the rivalry, the misfortunes, the heartbreaks, etc. All these things as well. And then the final solution is the neurotic symptom, right? But that's where psychoanalysis comes in, right? To deal with just the neurotic, but obviously there's more than just the neurotic in Civilization. But I think like, and going back to how you kind of align Freud as far as like what his political views would be, it's like the missing element is capitalism, which also creates those conditions. I think this is where, like, despite even Lacan not being a Marxist, I think Lacan actually has a better reading of capitalism than Freud. We could see him kind of map something out like a theory of capitalism in Seminar 16 and 17. And I think like when you situate like art and the discourse of science in this sort of like, at least science specifically, in this sort of paranoiac knowledge that I think is indicative of like, the way it relates to knowledge in the other in capitalism, right?
yeah, this is interesting because I think if we stick with like take Bernard Stiegler, his argument is that sublimation is no longer possible because of the reification of capitalism entering into domains where formerly our investment in like the field of culture, of kind of taking the mundane and the ordinary of our everyday life and making it something greater, that is what we defined as sublimation. Well, that capacity is grown inefficacious, which is a really interesting way to think about, I would even say, like problems of boredom of enome, of alienation, of dejection, and maybe even of depression, right? Where it's like commodification and the culture industry has seeped into our everyday life, where we have no autonomy over our everyday field of experience. And this erodes our capacity to actively construct social spaces that are in our measure, right? And so there's something to that, but I don't want to, we could like go down that rabbit hole all night. And I want to go back to where we were on some of the core definitional parts. I think we did a very good job about the 4 elements of the drive, but we didn't really dig into the concept of the death drive too much. I want to invite you maybe to say a few things about it. We kind of already hinted at it through this element of homeostasis, but I think it would be useful for folks to understand that we don't, like, maybe here's a question for you, Andrew, is like, how would you qualify the definition of death when we say death drive? Because it's not like, it's a bit paradoxical.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm glad we are circling back to this, because there's some stuff that went out and missing in translation, because it's just such a depth in-depth conversation, and it's just such a tall order to try to summarize the drive in one conversation. But it's amazing nonetheless. When we look at the death drive, going back to some key points that you said, um, and when I kind of articulated about like homeostasis, right? This is something with the pleasure principle, if it is the governing mechanism. Now, of course, it still is, but again, we have to look at Freud's revision in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, because the death drive ultimately has the tendency of compulsion repetition, mastering what is unfinished, right? Um, but he has this very cryptic and esoteric definition of the return to inanimate matter, right? And I want to go back to Seminar 2, because Seminar 2 is the seminar of the death drive and of a really close reading of Beyond the Pleasure Principle and the Entwurf. And there's this argument back and forth with Valabrega, Hippolyte, regarding this notion of the return to the inanimate. Is Freud was it organistic? Is this an organistic model? Is this like Freud's naturalism? Lacan wants to complexify it by returning to the reality and the pleasure principle, and showing that, like, well, the pleasure principle, yes, it tries to find some mode of tension that's bearable and homeostatic, but the death drive and its ability to repeat is ultimately what it's trying to do in that mastery. Now, the reality principle for Lacan is going to be something that complexifies that.
So that actually helps us connect. I feel as if in this conversation we can visualize these 4 dimensions. When we see the pulsional move to the death drive,
Yeah,
why every drive has a death drive is because that's its direction.
that's its direction. Yeah, but Lacan will not try to align with this like return to inanimate matter. Rather, we could see it as like a return to something unfinished, like the Zeigarnik effect. And he'll say, like, whenever we repeat, we fail to understand, the truth of our subjectivity, or what Freud will call the core of our being. So we learn in that moment and wish to do better next time. And by doing better next time, the patient or the subject will have to do something different, right? And this is this whole idea that Lacan proposes in the first 2 seminars, as like truth arises from error, or like the nature of the subject arises as a fundamental mistake, right? See that as like indicative of death drive, because again, like, this term death drive is so like grandiose. It's like it doesn't necessarily have to do with death, right? Maybe
Right.
there's some type of symbolic death that he'll talk about in Seminar 7, but it's not like offing oneself. It's
Right.
it's it's more of
And no,
just
and
like,
nor is it. So I think this is important for our more enlightenment prone, rationalist prone, careful listeners who maybe think that psychoanalysis does fetishize or sort of celebrate this kind of fatalistic idea of like, well, we are unconscious beings towards death, that the question of our agency is another dimension here, which I think is not a fatalistic conception, by the way. That's another thing we can kind of put a pin in that. But I just want to say that a lot of people like Christopher Lasch argued that the death drive was the worst part of Freud. And he said that because of how he saw people apply it in thinking about social and political matters. And I think he's sort of right and wrong at the same time, right? He's right that a lot of people do end up putting it or applying it in this kind of fatalistic way, where it's kind of like a bad anti-humanistic application of the death drive, right? Where all agency is evacuated in a certain way. I hate those readings of the death drive myself, but in the 70s, those were pretty in vogue, So it's kind of, I guess it's not too surprising that Lasch said, no, Freud reached his peak in the narcissism essay, not in Beyond the Pleasure Principle when he invents death drive. So that's a little side point, but please go back to what you were elaborating.
Yeah. I mean, like it's interesting because like you have like certain post-Freudians or even like Freudians of the Anna Freud tradition that will privilege that Freud, which Lacan will call Freud number two. So I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, Freud number one, which is the topography of, consciousness, perception, unconscious, preconscious system. And then middle Freud, the second Freud would be the Freud of narcissism, its relationship to reality, the ego ideal and superego. And third Freud, which is also the one that most Freudians, which, are not the Lacanian Freudians, um, privilege as well, which is ego, id, superego, right? Outside of the context of, the first topography. And, Lacan has so much polemics to say about that. But I think going back to our conversation, and like I was going to say, I think Lasch falls into like the second camp, maybe even the third camp. I'm not sure.
I would argue that Lacan does not read Freud in such a diachronic way.
No. Yeah, we know. We shouldn't. He's trying to show the primacy of
The
that first
unity
model.
of all
Yeah,
of all. Yeah.
exactly. And that they have functions to serve within the first model. But like
which
going
is
back to
which
what
is
I was
kind of nice because it's the same thing with Marx, where it's like we
right.
have early Marx, epistemological break. Lacan is not of like an epistemological
no,
break.
no, no. There's no epistemological break. Um, if anything, if I wouldn't even say it's epistemological break, but if there's something that is different, it's that both memory, seduction, and fantasy, even though Freud jettisons seduction, Laplanche will say it's still embedded in Freud, take on rather a production of the effective analysis après coup, retroactively, as a creation of the unconscious versus a lived event that happened exactly in one's childhood at a specific age and time. Right, that is the distinction between how Freud will theorize trauma, the primal scene, in his I think he makes this move in the Wolfman case. Right. That's exactly what the Wolfman's dream is. Anyhow, that's a digression. The point is, going back to Lacan, what's important about the death drive for him is not just that it still aligns with the compulsion to repeat, that he's not just trying to get rid of this like biological, organistic definition of the death drive, but he's, at least in seminar two, aligning it to the symbolic order, and that the symbolic order is sort of like this machinic process that breaks down because there's like an embedded flaw in it. Um, and he also in seminar four will take this thing and call it the hydroelectric power plant, because what he's trying to do is create a materialist conception of libido and the drive while positing his theory of the signifier. And he says, like, people will see like a hydroelectric power plant and think that before it was there, that energy was there in the river, right? That there must be like, kinetic energy, but it's like, no, it's because you have this machine, you have the dam, you have the reservoir and these conditions, that now we have a machine that accumulates and discharge. And while it discharges, it also accumulates, right? And because it's made a certain way, it breaks down. That is the nature of the death drive. And how do we account for this? Well, here's Lacan's revision of Freud's death drive and drive, etc. These conditions, to put it in psychoanalytic terms versus Lacan's weird analogies and myths, is the signifier. The signifier is the material byproduct of speech and discourse, and the fact that when we have speech and discourse, there is an other. So going back to this analytic, narcissistic, whatever type of attachment, um, those are the conditions for the signifier, and the signifiers function as death driven, right? As repetition, um, as also what breaks down and then emerges in the speech. Um, and so, like, that's the early Lacan. And I think in seminar 11, which I always find seminar 11 to be the most clarifying seminar, the most easily readable one, but also the most enigmatic, or just like because he's just so groundbreaking. And that's the fact that death drive now becomes that which misses its own object, right? Going back to the adrift, that like it's the aim, and the aim misses the object. And why that does so is because when we are in analysis, we would rather repeat and misrecognize our own troubles and traumas than to encounter them, right? Because in seminar 11, what he has, rather than the symbolic death drive, it's the real of the drive, as like a real encounter of the traumatic, right? And this we could see in the dream of Father, can't you see I'm burning? This is what Lacan will characterize as um, not only the encounter of the one's desire, but also of like, the aim and drive nature of the dream. But then also, uh, unlike seminar 2, where he's focusing on the symbolic repetition, the automaton, we have the tuke, the chance, the contingency, and the novelty of the death drive, which goes back to the unfinished Zeigarnik effect thing. Um, but also that it's still a part of the signifier, but yet there's something real about the drive missing the course, missing the object, or to put it in more psychoanalytic clinical terms, missing the encounter of one's desire or one's traumatic kernel, whether it's in something phantasmatic, something in the dream, or something that is said and gone unregistered in the transference, right? But yet it's still going to repeat, because transference at the final analysis, according to Lacan, is all about the compulsion repetition. Transference should not be seen at the level of affect. Transference should be seen at the level of the drive, because it relates to drives aim at love and aim at the unfinished project and trying to master that, but does not encounter it. It tries to miss it because it's so traumatic.
No, that's quite good. So when we talk about a signifier and the composition of a signifier as having a originary element of the death drive, I wonder if we could unpack this. It's a very interesting proposition in a way, because the signifier is not a corporeal or a biological entity, but it what is the signifier in the Lacanian sense, just for the benefit of listeners, and why does it have a relay or some kind of connection to this death drive? And I have my own kind of conception, but I want to invite you to sort of put a little bit of meat on those bones.
Yeah, I know, and I hope I'm not saying too much, because there's like, again, it's a lot, and we could just like get lost in the sauce talking about Lacan. But I think the signifier is so important for Lacan, and he goes at pains length in each seminar saying, for those of you who have not understood me, let me tell you again about what I mean by the signifier. But the signifier should be distinguished from the Saussurian sign, because the sign is what represents something to someone. And Lacan's sort of ingenuity with the theory of the signifier is that it becomes novel for him, and it's different from the sign and so sort. And it's his reading of Freud and looking at language and Freud's analysis of language and slips of the tongue, etc., that he privileges the Lacan will privilege this idea of the signifier, but its definition is simple as like, so you have like two aspects. The most famous one, which is always repeated but misunderstood, a signifier is what represents the subject for another signifier. But then there's the most important one, which is that the signifier gets its meaning from a relation to another signifier, because the signifier has no referent, right? It does not have substance.
Right.
Its sort of autonomy rests on a signifying chain
Right.
and its relation to other ones. So what does that mean? Well, it's it's his way to get back to something important in Freud when he talks about repression and the unconscious. It's this long-winded German term called Vorstellung,
Right.
Repräsentanz,
Right.
which is translated by Strachey as the ideational representation. And this is where I think D and G are wrong when they think that like Freud and Lacan are in this like representation type thinking, where like no, for the unconscious it's the representative. So the signifier is a representative for something that is absent, and that's the subject, and the subject is constituted by this signifier. So what that means is that when you undergo analysis, right, you start talking, you free associate, and you're actually constructing the subject vis-a-vis the signifier. And this is where also the notion of causality is important, because we don't have this first cause that then determines, okay, this is why you're like this now, right? This is post-Freudian thinking. This is the ego psychology Kleinian way of thinking, that there's a literal developmental moment where then like, okay, now you're a neurotic or you're a schizoid, good object, bad object thing because of this exact moment. No, of course, those real conditions matter in reality, but it's the retroactive causality, right, from a totality of effects that the effect of speech has in introducing this signifier, which, um, again, a signifier would be different for each person, singularity one by one, but ultimately the signifier is this representative of something traumatic that remains unsaid or half said, or designates the absence of the subject. I think this should also kind of maybe tie into a text that by Freud that I had you read as well in the list. It's called "A Child is Being Beaten." Right now, um, we could look at this like sort of beating sexual fantasy as what Lacan will call an axiom, right? Because the drive is axiomatic and it has a grammar to it. And this also relates to the signifier and the subject. So the rundown of the logic goes like this, that a father is beating a child, or my father is beating a child. I do not like the child, right? And so therefore the child is being beaten by the father. Or my father is beating a child, and in fear that I am doing something wrong, I make sure I'm the good one, and that, that other child that's being beaten is the one I don't like. It's my brother. Or I could be doing the beating, or my father's beating me. Ultimately, there's either somebody beating a child or a child is being beaten. Those are the two logics, right? A child is being beaten and somebody is beating a child. Now, why that matters with not only the drive as a sort of way of getting satisfaction from this grammatical logic of the fantasy, but why it relates to the signifier and the subject is because where is the subject located in those two statements? A child is being beaten. Well, where is the subject at? It's absent. It's a sort of neutral gaze. And I think in some ways, despite the sadistic, scopic, voyeuristic quality to these, or even the masochistic one, um, a neurotic can have this, a child is being beaten, where it's like there's a child being beaten, but it's where's the split subject at, right? Where's the subject? It's missing. I am beating the child. Okay, now we have a subject present because we have the I statement. Or my father or somebody is beating the child. Then we have something like a subject there alienated in the paternal other, right? So this is how we could see the signifier tie into the primal fantasy and the drive satisfaction insofar as something is being exhausted, repeated, and lived through in a perverse enjoyment.
So then in that case, a signifier is common. There's all kinds of signifiers we deal with day in and day out. But what is of interest for us in the Lacanian sense of a signifier is that it emerges from a particular operation of what Lacan calls metonymy. And I think this concept is very useful for understanding it insofar as when you hit upon a signifier in free association that is ends up being meaningful for you, it has emerged through a type of repetition which you often are not yourself conscious of conjuring it. So it's sort of conjured by your unconscious, and it is located by your analyst usually, and then pushed into the field of speech so that it is revisited and revisited and revisited, and therefore seen from and experienced from a different angle. And there's a certain interesting thing you're saying here about the kind of, almost want to say like metaphysical quality of the signifier that does not inhabit a substantial point of meaning. That I think is sort of key insofar as the wider Lacanian view, going back to this motif we've been talking about over and over of the nature of the drive and homeostasis and what we mean by death, that means that there's not a kind of great rapport that can never necessarily come with mastering the mystery of this signifier that haunts us or ensnares us. But let's give a concrete example to illustrate what we mean.
So one of the things,
let me give you, I'm about to do it. I was recently in an event, and somebody, I was talking, and I said the word test. And the affective background of the conversation was that the person who asked me a question was in fact had anxiety about my position, but in a good way, in the sense that they were, I guess is the best way you can have as a philosopher, as a teacher, when the student is visibly agitated about what you're saying precisely because what you're saying, it bothers them, right? But bothers them at this level of like, this is a part of political truth that I don't look at. And anyways, I said this word test, and it became you could say the cause, I guess, for this individual to sort of go mad. Like it was really bad, but in a good way, actually, because he then expressed like his true feelings about what he was agitated about. So like, but then I realized, speaking to him later, okay, he came to my house the day after and we spoke about it, is that he's African-American gentleman who had a long history of abusive practices of test taking in the context of intense inequality. So the signifier of test was enough to open up literally like Pandora's box, but it was productive, even though it was full of all of these points of aggression. So that's what a signifier does. So when we say that, like, oh yeah, all these Lacanians care about words so much, I'm just trying to give like a very concrete example, and maybe you have one too, of how this actually can materialize.
well, one of the things that I want to point out in that example is that one thing that I think has failed to kind of, or like most like Lacanians when they talk about like the signifier failed to kind of point out, is that the signifier is always heard, it's listened to, and it's always the analyst that hears it. The analyst is not looking for a signifier. They're not like trying to find some type of knowledge embedded within you. They don't know anything about you. There's a learned ignorance that you have to accept and invest in knowledge or even analytic knowledge. That's why like Kant says like, well, after an analysis and you receive another patient, you must reinvent analysis anew. But
Well,
my
hold
point
on, hold
is,
on. I want to
yes,
say one quick point about that. I think that's a
yeah.
brilliant point. I have one quick question, and I have a question.
Mhm.
The beautiful film based on the play Lacan's Parrot, or Adieu Lacan, the film, shows that yes, the methodology of the analyst kind of doing what you just said, because the way that you portrayed it, it's almost like depersonalized. But my argument and what the film shows is it's a film about a woman who actually did analysis with Lacan, and he discovered something about her attachment to a very particular signifier, which was her necklace. And he knew that this signifier was what, because this is a function that a signifier can also do, is that it, in fact, can compose the subject. And that's when you address it and you try to displace it or even get people to talk about it, it produces a lot of, like, for example, you can have very intense psychosomatic effects like vertigo, all kinds of feelings of anxiety, etc. But the point is that Lacan protected his patient when something happened. I'm not going to give away what happened. So there's also, even though Lacanian methodology doesn't necessarily put a big onus on that relational, I still think there is a level of relational that has to be there. Do you agree with that? And does
Yeah,
that make
and so
sense?
yeah, I like that example because that's a really good movie and a good play by Betty Milan. And I think that's the scene where he's like, "Are you indigenous?" And she reacts, but she has a sort of hard relationship with her indigenous roots. And I think she's like half Lebanese and half like Brazilian, um, and immigrated into Brazil and then like went to Paris to study the higher arts and be a Parisian. But yeah, you could see that similar reaction to the question, "Are you indigenous?" Almost similar to what is heard by this other example about the word test. And I like the test one because like if this were to be like an analytic session, we could see how even the word test can have a metonymic sliding, testimony, testicle, testing, the way that the shifter of the signifier could slide and can manifest in the dream where we have displacements or condensations with that signifier test. Um, and so like I think that's how we could see how yes. To your one question, it's not depersonalized. There is a relationship. It is asymmetrical though, because we have to account for the third other, which is going to be either the partner symptom or in the early and middle Lacan, the locus of the other, which is speech and language, and how that order of operation of sliding and quilting can operate in the session, either in a dream or in just free association. Um, and so like another thing is just to show that like why language is important is because there can be an affective quality, but most affects can be deceiving. It's really the one that hits and not really has necessarily just the aggressive response and agitation, but even the most anxiety provoking because it points to something real and even possibly uncanny, not just what about that makes you upset, but how much you actually in some ways are alienated by it and identify with it, right? This is why when he talks about anxiety and the uncanny, it's always seeing your desire and the object cause of it from the vantage point of the other that gazes back at you. It's your own alienation gazing back at you, right?
No, it's really good. Yeah. So, all right. This is very interesting. So I have the sense that we've defined death drive pretty adequately. I think the example of a child is being beaten is really interesting because what it shows is that element of the absence of the subject where there is a signifier, but it's in a type of abeyance. Could you remind me exactly like what the endpoint perhaps of this example is? Like, what is Lacan's main point with invoking it?
So yeah, because for Freud, he's trying to account. He gives a list of like 3 or 4 different types of patients. Like I forget the number of which are female, the other ones are male. But the ways in which like this beating fantasy can operate. And I think in reading Freud, Lacan is trying to give a more formalization, because I think this is Freud actually formalizing the drive away from the sort of biologism, to use Laplanche's example, the temptation of biology in Freud's theory of sexuality and the drive. We see a more formal Freud turning a fantasy into a logic, right? Without having that formalization that Lacan does. But what Lacan is trying to show is that, well, we shouldn't see fantasy as this imaginary component that most post-Freudians and Kleinians would see, because they only see fantasy as purely imaginary. There is an imaginary component to it, but there is a logic to it, and the logic is the fundamental axiom that drives literally the drive in a grammatical sense of this, and that this is, it's not about the content of the fantasy, but it's the function that this axiom serves for
Uh,
drive satisfaction, whether it be to alleviate the beating onto someone else or to witness the beating in at abeyance where the split subject is not
right.
there, right? Or if there's something sadistic or masochistic about it.
So how, and maybe this brings us back to how psychoanalysis and the question of the cure, or the traversal of the fundamental fantasy, or even sublimation, like these concepts, let's call them like positive concepts or constructive concepts in psychoanalysis. What I find so interesting about them is that I have some firsthand experience of them demonstrably being made realizable, meaning that if one has interrogated the tableau of repressed signifiers of in your life, through psychoanalysis, there are certain effects that can come about. And what's interesting here, though, of course, is I once, of course, had a friend of mine who's an analyst that said something very funny, which is there's some validity to the people who claim that if I'm an artist and I'm being very productive, sometimes not visiting elements that psychoanalysis wishes to visit in my psychic past can be good, because you may have created a rhythm of creativity that if you upset that, well, then your whole drive system has to kind of be reinvested and rerouted. So could you talk about what the drive looks like? And we saw this when we studied the graph of desire, where at the end of analysis, this sort of signifier that's oppressing you is replaced by the drive, but now in a way that's towards freedom. So the death drive and freedom are synonymous at a certain level of psychoanalytic thought, I would say. And I think here in the traversal of fundamental fantasy and completing analysis, how does the drive look different, or how is it unencumbered, or how is it more free? Or do you not think about it that way?
No, I think I do, but you have to, in the Lacanians at least, like, because probably have to jet soon. So I think just to kind of simply put it, um, in the fundamental fantasy that formula that Lacan has, it's Bard S, losange, and little a, right? Now, the way that the end of analysis would work is not a split subject entangled by a fantasy and alienated from their cause of desire. Now, in relation to the drive, we have one's own jouissance, not alienated by the other, right? Not put in a master's discourse where there is fundamental fantasy, but now the ability to use one's own jouissance as a sort of mechanism for liberation. Now, I just mean that not in the political sense. I mean that in like the more psychoanalytic sense, like how to use one's own enjoyment and I guess sublimate. But it's like being able to speak. And there's something that happens in analysis in the Lacanian sense where you know how to do something with words. Your words have an effect. Like it almost sounds like, and maybe that's something that we just have to deal with as like psychoanalysts. We sound woo woo, we sound esoteric, but there's something about the experience of undergoing an analysis. And I have not finished my analysis. I've been in analysis for about 6 years now. I did a couple years with the Jungian, almost like 4 with my former analyst who's a Lacanian. I'm with another Lacanian who's more Malarian, and it's more of like being able to speak, and not just speak well, but being able to speak in a way that it has a truth effect,
Yeah,
right? Or it has an effect that really can be transferential to some people,
absolutely.
some ways that like it's enigmatic, some ways in which like it, like especially like you could have people that are, they've never necessarily undergone analysis, but they have a profound way of like teaching people by appealing to their experience, and the way that their experience kind of like affects them. Like again, going back to that example of Fred Moten, I think in some ways like that's like a way of like, I guess, handling one's own jouissance or one's own drive to create something or to inspire people, or even just the fact that, oh, now your own drive is the fact that you want to be an analyst yourself, right? um I think that's the short answer, and it maybe not be the best answer that maybe people want to hear, but that's really what it is that
Yeah,
to kind of have your drive and your jouissance affecting you in a way where there is a new autonomy, and you do
yeah.
things with language pretty much.
No, 100%.
Yeah.
No, this is excellent.
Mhm.
Andrew, I want to thank you for joining me and elucidating with great skill and erudition all of these points, and it was really fun. Let's continue this and do a part 2. In the comments, let us know what you want us to talk about next. Maybe it's another difficult concept that you want to know more about from Lacanian field or from psychoanalysis in general. And Andrew and I may take you up on that offer or on that question. I think that'd be cool. We could do like a series of conceptual videos. This was
Yeah.
a great start. So thanks for coming on.
Of course. Thank you for inviting me. Always a pleasure.
All right, comrades. Until next time.